Hey, good morning, everybody, and I'm sorry I'm a little bit late. Let's get at it. It's been obviously a very busy week. Unfortunately, earlier this week, the president signed the reconciliation bill, which, if I can remind you, is $70 billion for ICE and CBP. That's on top of the over $140 billion that went into ICE and these agencies in the big ugly bill. ICE now has a bigger budget than the FBI. It has a bigger budget than the French army. And, I think ICE plays a critical role, not against the notion of ICE, but I do believe there need to be reforms. We saw the tragedy in Minneapolis, but we've also seen the kind of violence that's taking place now up in Newark, New Jersey, at a facility. I think the vast majority of Americans want guardrails on ICE. And again, let's be clear, cut to the chase. What we want ICE to operate is under the same rules that our state police and our local police operate. Identify themselves, don't wear these masks all the time, operate on good policing protocols. And we thought we were going to see progress on that, but then the administration shut down. So that $70 billion borrowed as well to go to ICE at the same time that we are cutting health care. We've had 33,000 Virginians lose health insurance from the Obamacare cuts. We'll see 300,000 more after November when the Medicaid cuts come in. I've seen 13 Virginia rural hospitals say they may close. And this is where we're going to put our resources as opposed to health care. So I think a huge mistake, and it's one of the reasons why the president's at record lows in terms of numbers. On a more optimistic note, I had a great session Monday with families, military families down in Hampton Roads. Many of the families there had family members that were either deployed on the Ford or part of the carrier group. They've been deployed for the longest deployment since the Vietnam War. We've got to do a much better job across the country, but particularly in Hampton Roads, of retaining and helping our military families. The president has asked for $1.5 trillion on a defense budget, but no increase in military health care benefits, housing benefits, all of the things that keep the force strong. We came up with a list of action items. We've already contacted DOD to say, these military spouses, if the deployment goes beyond what was projected, they ought to get a little more flexibility in work schedules. We want to make sure that there's some additional reimbursements on TRICARE, because more and more providers are not taking TRICARE, and unfortunately it is really undermining the quality of care for our active duty. We had a good conversation about, if you're a spouse or a veteran or a family member, you got PTSD, you get a list of 100 providers on mental health, but you don't know who's taking, who's got openings. So we've got a working group together, and this is a case where we could be the model for the country. We've got local governments that are interested in helping both active duty and veterans. We've got the state, and I was proud when I was governor to dramatically increase the amount of state services to our veterans. We've obviously got a lot of federal entities, and then we've got a whole host of nonprofit organizations. What they don't do a great job of talking to each other and providing an easy front end to that military spouse or family or even veteran. And so we've got a plan, and I'll have more to say about this. It could be a really good news story on how we help our military families. And Virginia could be the lead on this, both in terms of helping our families, but also retaining folks as they phase out of the military. Veterans are a great workforce. We lose too many after they serve in Virginia to go elsewhere. If we could be the place that provides that support network between the nonprofit and governmental sector, that could be great for the Hampton Roads community and all of Virginia. It's not just Hampton Roads, but Hampton Roads, obviously the biggest concentration. Two other items. One, I announced legislation to increase cybersecurity using CISA. CISA is the voluntary organization between the private sector and the government to make sure we have cybersecurity standards. We have let those lapse in many cases, particularly now as we enter into an era where this tool called Mythos that came out of Anthropic, which was able to basically penetrate all of our classified systems and almost all of our private systems, we have to increase our cybersecurity protections right now. Increasingly, I mean, the director of Cyber Command, the general in charge of Cyber Command, told me recently, after Mythos, the whole nature of warfare has changed because of the vulnerability. You can't use your radar, you can't use your satellites, you can't use all of our technology-based weapons if they're hacked into and crippled. So we have to really up our game, particularly as we see the advent of artificial intelligence coming. And this is an area that should be a no-brainer and bipartisan, but unfortunately, the Trump administration, which created CISA in its first term and helped build up a worthy entity, has cut over a third of its employees and cut back on its capabilities. And I can nerd out on some of the ISAC tools that are out there. But at a very time when we need to increase our protections against China, Russia, Iran, North Korea on the cyber front, and that expanded by AI, this administration is unilaterally disarming. So my legislation would put those resources back and reinvigorate these tools to make sure we're protected. Finally, and I'll wait for questions on FISA 702 if you want, which I'm in the middle of. But the final comment I want to make is, again, the ongoing effects of this war of choice with Iran. The president has said 30 different times in the last few weeks that the war is over. Obviously, the war is not over. If anything, the president seems to be escalating. None of the goals the president had of regime change, securing the enriched uranium, making sure that Iran didn't have the ability to strike back, which they are clearly striking back against our allies in the region, and making sure the Strait of Hormuz is open. None of that is happening. And while we've seen gas prices tick down a little bit, they're still about $4.25. You know, every expert has said we have so depleted all of the world's kind of reserves that by July 4th, those prices, even if the president declares victory tomorrow, are going to skyrocket back up. And this is not just about gas prices. It's about grocery prices, which has most of their goods delivered by trucks that run on diesel. It's about airline prices. The airline tickets are skyrocketing. It's about aluminum costs. And again, don't believe me, inflation last quarter was over 4%. That's about as bad as the worst days under Biden. And you got, again, this is what happens when a president starts a war of choice and doesn't have a full-fledged plan. And Americans are going to be paying for that at the pump, at the grocery store, if they try to travel, and virtually even declaring victory, none of that is going to get reversed quickly, and that's unfortunate. So with that, I will turn it over to Kath and be happy to take your questions.
Senator, our first question is from Mitchell with WTOP.
Good morning, Senator. Thanks a lot for joining us. As you would expect, I'm going to ask you a question about FISA. Speaker Johnson today accused Democrats of holding Section 702 hostage for political reasons. And at the same time, Bill Pulte this week apparently tried to notify Tulsi Gabbard he was ready to immediately take over for her, although that didn't happen. I wanted to get your thoughts on those developments and the possibility that this program could potentially go dark.
Section 702 is a critical tool that we use to protect Americans. If it goes dark, one person will be responsible, Donald Trump. This is always a controversial item to get renewed. But we were working in a bipartisan way to have a bill that would renew FISA for 3 years with additional reforms. 10 days ago, the president threw a live hand grenade in putting forward an individual with no qualifications to be the director of national intelligence, Bill Pulte. His only qualification is being a Trump hatchet man, and he has shown a complete disregard of any kind of confidential information. You know, if he couldn't keep mortgage information secret, thinks what he'll do if he's in charge of all of our intelligence agencies. And the law is clear. The law says if you want to nominate somebody, they've got to have national security experience. He has zero. And even my Republican friends have said the same. And we're now at an emergency. So I am more than happy to do a short-term extension if the president follows the law. The law says if the director of national intelligence leaves, the acting becomes the number two. The number two is a Trump-appointed, Senate-confirmed 25-year professional, Mr. Lucas. He becomes the interim. I'll sign off on a 3-week, 4-week extension today. But no, you've got the president disregarding the law again. Frankly, I disagreed with Tulsi Gabbard, but I never questioned her qualifications. And Pulte already going in trying to fire her. This is outrageous. And please look at, people will scream and shout. I've been clear. This is not Republican Senate problem. We were working in good faith. Even on this one, I think even the Speaker has tried to work in good faith. We had presented, with working with people in the cabinet, a series of off-ramps for the president. He rejected them. People will do the pointing back and forth, but there is no one in the national security domain that doesn't, you get them to tell the truth, they will say, if this goes dark, the person responsible is Donald Trump. And again, I keep questioning whether he even wants this to be renewed. Because Mitchell, a couple of months ago, we had all of the intelligence community in saying how important 702 was. And then we said, well, what is the position of the Trump White House? They had no position. It's only been in the last 6 or 7 weeks that Trump White House has even came out in favor of 702. Totally irresponsible. I hope there is cooler heads will prevail. But one person responsible here, Donald Trump. And I think, again, look at the comments of particularly my Senate Republican colleagues who've said, this is a White House problem.
Senator, our next question is from Audra with Sinclair Broadcast Group. Audra, are you there? Okay,
Hi.
our next question is from...
Hi. So I have my quick question is, what are you planning to do to help those who rely on Social Security, and who have been paying into it for years only to get ready to retire and not being able to use as much as they were into planning, like use?
Well, listen, I've had a plan for Social Security for over a decade that said we've got to raise the cap so those of us who've done well can pay more in. At the same time, we need to, and the cut line could have been earlier, but we need to say to people under 35 or under 30, you may have to wait an extra year, the same thing that happened back in 1983 between President Reagan and then Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. And that what we ought to do is make Social Security solvent for 50 years, and then every 10 years, you've got to make it solvent for the next 50 years going forward. It was a logical, rational program, a proposal that came out of the Simpson Bowles and my Gang of Six in 2011 and 12. Unfortunately, both parties have punted. And Social Security is actually the easiest one to fix because it's math. The thing is, people are living longer. That's great. But if you're only paying in a small amount and that's not adjusted up for those of us who have the ability to pay in a little bit more, and people are living longer, obviously there's not going to be enough left in the pot. I think Social Security is sacrosanct. I think we absolutely have an obligation to protect it. And we could fix it by raising the cap, making it solvent for 50 years, and yes, looking at a slight age adjustment for people under 30 or 35. I've not met a single person under 30 or 35 that really thinks they're going to get Social Security. So saying you may have to wait an extra year to get it, I had no pushback.
Senator, our next question is from Michael with Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Good morning, Senator. I have a question that's not federal related. Do you have any thoughts on the budget situation in Virginia and how that can affect the party with going into congressional midterm elections. We still don't have any real progress on a budget solution. Even
Michael,
though,
yeah.
we got a triumvirate.
As a former governor, I don't overly weigh in, but I will say this. Virginia's earned its reputation as the best state for business. We need to maintain that, and I don't think we should go back on our word. And I also don't believe that the approach that some other states are taking around total moratoriums makes sense. But I do think, and I think this would be better done at the federal level, I think there needs to be the responsibility for these data centers to pay their fair share. And that means no increase in the utility bills, making sure there's disclosure of appropriate use of water, making sure there are appropriate setbacks so that neighborhoods are not unduly affected, making sure that even if the power is clean, that the backup power is also safe and secure, and making sure that before a community agrees, you have to have full disclosure of all the terms. Because if you don't do that, we're seeing already in Virginia, community after community turn them down. So I think there is a path to get there. I'd rather see it at the federal level. I'm not going to weigh in on the particulars, but I want Virginia to maintain its business reputation, and I also want to maintain, I don't think, we're not going to put, just say this, AI is here. We're not putting the genie back in the bottle. I think the decision on location of these data centers ultimately needs to be left to the community, but I do think there needs to be a minimum set of standards, and I've co-sponsored legislation at the federal level, and I'm looking at even more extensive ways to do this. And I have looked at ways that, one of the ways that we can, getting into how we fund some of this is really problematic at the federal level. You have a token tax, a utility tax that may push people to Chinese open source models. I'm looking at something I think pretty creative about saying, while the benefits of AI may be downstream, they're collecting the companies are collecting all the benefits up front. So delaying for some time their use of accelerated depreciation on these buildings could be one stick, but it could also generate some revenue, because you've heard me talk, Michael, in the past, that I really believe we are going to have a major short-term job dislocation problem, particularly for people coming out of college. And we don't have anything in place to how we really train people for the AI-ready economy.
Senator, our next question is from...
I just wanted
Senator,
to
our
clarify.
next question...
Never mind.
Go ahead. Our next question. Go ahead, Catherine.
Senator, our next question is from Emma with the Virginian Pilot.
Hey, Senator Warner. I have a quick question about military retention. You said at the roundtable last Monday that you were worried about the kind of stress that this kind of war puts on folks who are deployed and their families. And I was wondering, what kind of conversations to that effect you've had with service members, and if you've given specific reasons for wanting to get out of their service once they've completed their contract.
If you were planning on a 6-month deployment, you can plan for that. You can plan for child care. You can plan on, how you're going to, who's going to work, who's going to do what. But if that deployment goes from 6 to almost 12 months, you miss birthdays, births, deaths. Your child care may run out. And our sailors will do their duty, and they did it extraordinarily. But the fact that the Ford was headed in one direction and then taken over to the Caribbean to be off Venezuela, then moved over to the Eastern Med, and as good as our ships are, a 12-month deployment, we've seen a fire on the Ford where a lot of the bunks were destroyed. So they'll do their duty, but I do think if a deployment goes beyond what was expected, there needs to be some grace offered to these families. There needs to be additional child care support. We've already, one of the spouses in this meeting, it was like, it was not asking much. She said, because our child care ran out she was going to be half an hour late to work and was afraid of losing her job. Well, damn, and I've written the DOD and others, if you're on an extra long deployment, you got to get some grace at work period, some flexibility, because we will drive our sailors and our soldiers and our airmen out of the military. They will do their duty. But I worry with this administration. It wants to buy more stuff at an unprecedented level, armaments, machine, tools, satellites. But the corresponding investment in our families and our veterans isn't there. Matter of fact, we spent years getting a new veterans facility open on the south side to complement the facility in Hampton. We can't fill the healthcare spaces there because the VA's been under such assault. I mean, the irony of we want to stand by our military, but we don't give a damn about their families or our veterans, it's outrageous. These are the most patriotic people in the country, and the spouses that are at home, male or female, are every bit as patriotic as their spouse that's in active duty. And we need to treat them with more respect. So you will see out of this, and I'll be back down on this very subject. We've got a half a dozen action items that came out of that. We've already acted on the DOD about flexibility on work schedules. We are working on trying to do some additional flexibility on TRICARE. We are working on a better, and I think this will be very exciting, I'm not ready to talk about it yet, an ability to use some technology tools to really make all of these services much more accessible. AI promises all this, these agentic agents. Well, maybe we ought to have an agentic agent for every military spouse that can go out and search all of the services, local, state, federal, nonprofit, so that spouse doesn't have to do it, and present it in plain English. So there is more to come, but the hypocrisy of increasing the defense budget to $1.5 trillion, what the president wants, without any corresponding support for families and from housing to food. A third of our active duty are food insecure. That makes no sense at all. It's an embarrassment.
Sir, our next question is from Charlie with ABC 13. Charlie, are you there? Okay, our next question is from Michael with Virginia Dogwood.
Hi. The House this week passed the Faster Labor Contracts Act with 20 House Republicans supporting it. It's now with the Senate. So I was wondering, Senator, is that a bill you plan to support? And do you think enough Senate Republicans will support it to have it passed?
Well, I just heard about it, and it was, I think, a rare combination between the business community and part of the labor community in terms of speeding up how these contracts get implemented, and in terms of also giving workers the right to organize and then do it in a quick way. So while I've not seen all the details, my clear intent sounds like I'm going to be supportive. I want to look at it. I've not really heard much about it, but I heard the story on one of the media, and it sounds like a pretty darn good bill.
Senator, those are all the questions we have today.
All right. Thanks, everybody.